All right, today we're going to start talking about the Reconstruction era in United States history. This is the period of time from 1865 to 1877. The objectives for this section are to identify and explain the major problems that needed to be fixed in the United States following the Civil War, analyze these problems and how they were addressed by the government, and assess how successful these problems were. Number 3, examine the treatment of newly freed slaves in the South and the ways in which white Southerners attempted to keep African Americans from gaining equal rights. And number 4, to predict how the Reconstruction era could have led to growth in the United States industry and business. So, what is Reconstruction? What is it, and what could it possibly be? What needed to be reconstructed? And Reconstruction is basically the rebuilding of the entire Southern population. Places that were destroyed, cities that were wiped out, and also the change. How do we change from an economy that was based off of slavery to an economy that could also produce successful people to do the jobs that the slaves once did? So what are also the potential problems and the issues that need to be addressed during this period? And that's what we're going to talk about in today's lecture. So the issues that need to be addressed during the Reconstruction, first one is, what would be the punishment given to succeeding Southern states before they're let back into the Union? Number 2, what branch of government will be in charge of making laws and handing punishments out during Reconstruction? Number 3, what could the country do to help the newly freed slaves adjust to society? And number 4, how could the country make the Southern economy healthy again? So President Lincoln had a 10% plan. Now, President Lincoln was all about making sure that we could rebuild the country and keep things safe. He started off with his second inaugural address, and he said his idea was with malice towards none and with charity for all, meaning that he wanted to see how we could become a country once again without and sort of forget about all the malice and all the hatred that existed prior to the start of the Civil War. So he had a very weak plan, and he was more of a forgiving plan. Southern states should be required to take a loyalty oath and add a constitutional amendment that bans slavery. He promised the troops occupation until the passage of Southern states, but this is ultimately going to be rejected by Congress, meaning that they thought it was too weak. His plans were too kind and too forgiving towards what the South did, because think about all the lives that were lost during this conflict. So the readmission of Southern states began with the Reconstruction Act of 1867. And here what they do is the states are going to be divided into 5 military districts under the control of the President of the United States. And in this act, they're going to be required to rewrite the state constitutions and pass the 14th Amendment, which we'll talk about in just a few moments. So all but 4 states are going to be readmitted by 1870, with the exception of Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia, and I'll explain that in just also a second. So here's a map of the military reconstructions in the zones that you see. First, of course, you have number 1, which is up here in Virginia. 2 is the Carolinas. 3 is Alabama and Georgia and Florida. 4 is Arkansas and Mississippi. And then 5 is Texas and Louisiana. The only state of the Southern Confederacy that was different was Tennessee, because it was readmitted before military reconstruction was established in 1867. Again, the states that were closer to the Mason-Dixon line were able to have more of an impact on the changes, with the exception of Virginia because of the harsh history. So all this plan was coming into order, and all of a sudden you see the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. In 1865, in April, he was at Ford Theater, and he was killed and shot by John Wilkes Booth. But obviously through history, we know now that it was part of a much larger conspiracy trying to assassinate the president. Andrew Johnson is going to become the President of the United States. And this is going to have lots of effects on the U.S. population. Think of it from the perspective of an African American and slave in the South coming through and thinking that the President supported you and was trying to change things for the better. Now the leader, the person who was inspiring so many for positive change, was gone. And who knew what was going to happen with Andrew Johnson when he became the President? Obviously, he was from a different party. This is still a time where you were elected based off a popular vote. So first place would become president, second place would become vice president. So those two didn't necessarily see eye to eye. Johnson was more forgiving towards Lincoln in those ideas. So other people who were the conspirators, and we're not going to really talk much about this, but these are some of the images of the people who had discussed or were involved in some way with the assassination of the President of the United States. So, talking about things that were important during this time, the Freedmen's Bureau. To answer that second question we'd asked before, was the Freedmen's Bureau was sort of like an early supporter of almost a welfare system or a safety net system that was going to help organize and provide means of living to both black and white refugees in the South. And some of the ideas were clothing and food, education and housing, to try to make sure that they could re-assimilate or assimilate a culture where every person had some type of say or some type of opportunity to be successful. It was enacted in 1865, but it was abolished by 1872. So a lot of the promises that were given during that time from the Freedmen's Bureau on behalf of the United States government weren't necessarily followed. You can see some things. There was a lot of racism, of course, at this time. The agency was to keep the Negro in illness at the expense of the white man. Twice vetoed by the president, made law by Congress. So again, it just shows that there was still such a separation, meaning that even the whites in the North were not sold 100% as a society on whether slavery should exist, especially when you see these former African Americans moving towards the North after the Civil War in order to try to find jobs or things which we'll talk about through the next few decades. In the South, there was also things that were called black codes, and these were laws that were passed by southern states to try to limit the rights of new black citizens. Of course, we remember from when we talked about the review in the WebQuest about the different laws that were enacted that didn't give African American men or women the opportunity to be considered citizens of the United States. These black codes were enacted as a way to try to bring back those laws, meaning though even though we said slavery was over, there were still laws at the local and state level that were discriminatory towards African Americans. It was an attempt to keep blacks as secondary citizens and limit the work and wage opportunities. Mississippi and South Carolina are going to be the first states to enact those laws in 1865. So, looking at some of these amendments, and we'll talk about an amendment, the Constitution of the United States, which you've learned about in the last history class, is the rolling document of the land, meaning that everything on that paper is the supreme law of the land. But besides that, what happens is we have the ability to amend the Constitution. The first 10 amendments of the Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights, but during these early years in the Civil War amendments, we come up with three very significant ones. The 13th Amendment is going to ban slavery. The 14th Amendment is going to provide for equality under the law for all citizens. But of course, that doesn't necessarily give them the right to vote. African Americans and women at this time were still not given that opportunity. 15th Amendment comes out, and that's going to give African American men the right to vote. So still you see a lack of equality, even though the 14th Amendment was about equality under the law. The 15th Amendment doesn't give that same right to African American women. 14th Amendment also known for the whole idea of due process of the law, meaning that every person has the ability to go through the court system and challenge. So here's a couple of political cartoons talking about the years and what amendments helped the slaves. In 1866 elections, in the Northern radical Republicans gained the power in the United States Congress, and they created that 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. At that time. So the Democrats were running in the South as a sort of a pro-slavery group, or not even pro-slavery, as pro-old world, meaning that they didn't want to see things change. And the Northerners, as long as it didn't affect them, they were really pushing for equality under the law in that whole idea of the new radical Republicans pushing for the 14th and the 15th Amendment. I think that this one right here, the 14th Amendment right here, erases the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, which said slaves did not have the rights. This amendment was granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States, regardless of race. But this little thing down here says, in reality, freed slaves do not get equal protection under the law. Blacks can still not testify in many trials. So here you have an African American. It says, but he kidnapped my son. He's forcing my Joshua to work on his farm. And case dismissed, because again, the laws were set up in the southern states to try to keep African Americans as slaves. So much so that we had to change the way politicians were voted. So in the South, thousands of blacks registered to vote. following that 14th and 15th Amendment. And we have two very historic ideas. The first is, of course, we had the first black senator in Hiram Revels of Mississippi. And also we have a Northern Civil War hero, which was Ulysses S. Grant. He's going to be elected president in 1870. And both of these things are seen as giant victories for the Republican Party at this time, which was the anti-slavery party at that time. Social reforms. Of course, when you have segregation, it's going to see how things are going to change. So the African Americans are going to head to southern cities for better job opportunities, better schools, and better churches. And what you see is a fallback or a pushback from the people who lived in the areas, those people who were part of the community. And this is where you're going to start seeing the whole idea of hate groups that were trying to push or suppress the ability for the African Americans to have the equal rights. This is going to be where you see the introduction of the Ku Klux Klan, and they're going to have a reaction to the Enforcement Acts, doing lots of tremendous hateful crimes to stop African Americans from achieving equality through scare tactics and things that are all the way up into murder or death. Some imagery of the Ku Klux Klan being able to do things in the night, dressed in costume, and they were very much protected in the South. They were very much protected in that way. So, not all history is always pretty and clean. So it's just kind of interesting to see, where we stood as a people. Now, was the Klan available, or was it readily available in the North? There were parts of the country that were readily available to the Ku Klux Klan. However, the majority of people in the North still considered themselves to be the radical Republicans or anti-slavery. Besides this, the main thing that changed in the idea of slavery in the South was the economy. Previously, everything was based off of slave agriculture. Now we have two other concepts that are going to come up there. The first one is going to be called sharecropping, and this is where the owners lend the land and cede to the poorer workers. And the other is tenant farming. So it's like renting apartments, but with farming land. It comes out to the whole idea that no matter what you call it, African Americans that were enslaved in the South did not have the same opportunities that white people had. And in this aspect, you look at it because what is sharecropping? So I'm going to bring one of these slaves, these former slaves, these freed slaves onto my land, give them the land and tell them that they could work it, and they have to give me so much of their profit. And in reality, what I'm doing is kind of giving them the same job that they had before. We're telling them they're free, but in reality, they never really were still at this point. The same thing like tenant farming. Renting an apartment but with farming land. They were renting the land, but they were getting charged such high wages that the local and state governments didn't step in. The federal government had to step in to stop it from happening because you were seeing these slaves because they knew nothing. You think about this from the perspective of, for generations, all the slaves knew was what their parents taught them. So they grew up in a society and a culture where that's all they knew. So what could we do to fix it? You weren't going to be able to send them to school because schools were still in the process of building. We had very few opportunities, so the only thing they could do was go back to what they knew, which was cropping. In that sense, were they ever really free? You can see the percentage of farms that sharecrop by county. A lot of land, especially you look at this in the North Carolina, the tobacco regions, South Carolina, Georgia, the cotton field regions, to see how much was actually done. So again, the whole economy of the South was based off of agriculture. So at this point, all that was going to happen was more of the same. So you're going to have an election for the president to see what type of government or culture we wanted to have. And the change elections happen when something significant happens. Like, when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, who would have known what would have happened after that? So we had two different people. We had Rutherford B. Hayes and Sam Tilden. Hayes was a radical Republican and Tilden was a Democrat. At this point in time, you had the Republicans who were sort of pushing again. The majority of them were pushing for anti-slavery and laws at the federal level to stop the southern states from kind of forcing people back into slavery. Tilden, as a Democrat at this time, was more pro-state government. Now, he was not as extreme, or they were not as extreme as a party as they were in the past, but it was going to be a very closely contested race because people were seeing changes. And every time there's a change, there's always kind of a pushback. So Lincoln brought a lot of change, and all of a sudden, what were we to push back? So Hayes, the Republican, and Tilden, the Democrat. Tilden's going to win the popular vote. and Hayes is going to win on the Electoral College. So this is going to be a big fight, and this has continued to happen in history over and over again, even in the last election. The person who won more votes didn't get the presidency because of the Electoral College. The Electoral College is an old-fashioned system where each state gets the votes, and you have to win the popularity of each state in order to get the electoral votes. So even though Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, won more votes, he wasn't elected president, and the South is going to be upset and dispute the election, saying that we want to have that Democrat in there because he's going to be more pro towards our views. So there's going to be a fight back and forth regarding that. But of course, at the end, Rutherford B. Hayes is going to be sworn in as the president of the United States, and it's going to mark his whole period is going to be all about Reconstruction. But the end of Reconstruction is going to come from the election of Ulysses S. Grant. And it's going to become because of a lot of different things. The loss of faith in Reconstruction movement, the electing of Hayes over Tilden, and the Compromise of 1877 leads to the withdrawal of troops in the South, and it's going to change the way we look at things. So even though we were upset with the South, the federal government tried to incorporate them into the planning of fixing the nation, because the only way you could truly repair what was happening was to bring both sides together, whether you were happy or not. So what are the effects of the Reconstruction? The first thing is the Union is going to be restored, meaning that the South and the North are going to come together, all the states are going to come together, and we're going to understand that the federal government is going to have more power than the state government, meaning that the state government can pass laws as long as it doesn't interfere with constitutional rights that are granted by the Constitution of the federal government. The African Americans gained citizenship and voting rights, but again, they were never truly free at this point in time. I'm going to show you some things through some voting, the actual voting tests that were given in some states. You're still going to see racial inequality, and you're going to see a rise in the Ku Klux Klan. The Southern economy is going to be rebuilt, but again, it's going to be on the backs of most slave labor, even though it's not considered slavery at that time. And we're going to have a new system called sharecropping in the South. But we're going to, as a society, realize that the South is going to have to make some changes, because enough of the agricultural movement is not going to support or sustain a free society. So you're going to see the migration of African Americans into different places like cities in the North. Over the next course of the decades, as time goes on, the government is going to ask them for help. So the next thing I'm going to have you do is you're going to answer some questions. The first thing on your own is, during this Reconstruction period, why was there a struggle between the legislative and executive branches? And I want you to give me an example of this struggle. Number 2 is, predict the national impact or the list of one or more effects of the death of Abraham Lincoln. How did that change our society, and how would things went had he survived